Chapter 9 of The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds by John Luther Langworthy. Chapter 9. Startling News Over the Wire. "Frank, is he kidding us?" finally cried Larry, turning to the pilot of the new biplane, for Andy sometimes liked to joke his chums, as they well knew. "Not this time," replied Frank. "And somebody did really and truly shoot at you," gasped Elephant, holding up his hands in horror. "Huh. What do you think of these holes through the planes?" demanded Andy, drawing attention to the stout tan cloth that constituted the air-resisting cover of the framework. "Oh my, it's so, as sure as you live," cried Elephant, thrusting a finger through one of the little openings. "And not 5 feet away from where you sat. What a terrible shame. Whoever could have been so wicked?" "We don't know," returned Andy soberly, "but we're going to try and find out. And all I can say is that if we do, we're going to make it mighty warm for him, no matter who he may be." "He ought to be tarred and feathered," gritted Larry. "Of all the mean and contemptible things anybody can do, I think the worst is to shoot at a fellow up in a balloon or an aeroplane, because they can't fire back, and the least accident means death to the aviator." "Bully for you, Larry!" exclaimed Andy. "My sentiments exactly," remarked Elephant with a vim. Poor stuttering Nat wanted to echo what Larry had said, but of course the excitement had seized him in its grip, so that words positively refused to pour from his parted lips. So after making a great effort, amid much twisting of his facial muscles, he contented himself with patting Larry on the back and nodding, as if to stand for everything the other had said. "Well, let's drop that subject for the present, fellows," Frank suggested. "We saw that you had visitors while we were away, Larry." "Why, yes. Your friend Mr. Marsh dropped in to say howdy-do. He breezed in some unexpectedly to us, for we happened to be all inside when he stepped across the sill, and said he was delighted to renew our acquaintance." "Yes, go on, please," urged impatient Andy. But there was no hurrying Larry. When he had anything to tell, he always insisted on narrating it after his own fashion. "Of course I jumped for him right away," he went on slowly, "and managed to escort him outdoors, all the while explaining how Frank here had plainly left word that nobody was to be allowed inside the shop besides us 3. "How did he seem to take it?" asked Frank. "Oh, he wasn't at all flustered, as far as I could see," came the ready reply. "Elephant here says he saw him frown and bite his lips, as I grabbed his arm and hustled him out, but I only saw him smile, pleasant-like, and then he said it was all right, and that he didn't blame you one whit for being careful, that perhaps if you knew him better you might invite him in." "He said all that, did he?" Frank continued. "Sho, 10 times as much. That man has the gift of gab. He can wrap you right around his finger, I reckon," Larry went on. "Told you so," exclaimed Andy, nodding his head in affirmation. "But seems he didn't wrap you around very much," Frank laughingly said, "because you didn't take him back in again, did you?" "He never asked me. Perhaps I would have done if he had, but I don't know. He's sure got a way about him that's terribly convincing," Larry muttered. "And he went off pleasantly, didn't he? I saw you shake hands with him," continued Frank. "As smooth as oil. Why, I can feel his grip yet. It was that strong. Thought my bones had cracked that time. Wonder who Mr. Marsh is, anyway, Frank. Do you know?" "I do not," was the prompt reply Larry received, for if Frank happened to have any suspicion, he did not consider it his duty to confide the same to everybody who expressed the least curiosity. When the biplane had been safely housed, Frank dodged into the shop as though to convince himself that nothing had been taken. When the others followed, they found him moving around. Finally, he came to stand near the door and called out once more to Larry. "Was he in this far when you discovered him?" "What say, boys? It must have been about there, eh?" the one addressed remarked, appealing to his comrades for their opinions. "Just about," Elephant answered, while Nat nodded his head as the easiest way to cut a Gordian knot. "Oh, well, he couldn't see anything worthwhile from here," Frank went on. "Now, did any of you notice whether he used his eyes to look around, or was he only bent on saying howdy-do to you?" "When Larry grabbed him by the arm and started to lead him out, I saw the gentleman take a good look all around, and that's the truth," Frank, Elephant remarked. Frank hardly knew what to think. This might be a very significant thing, and then again, if one looked at it another way, Was it not simply what any curious stranger, interested in the doings of the venturesome bird boys, might have done? It was about 10 o'clock and growing quite hot, since the time was July. Just as Andy had hinted, that bank of dark clouds hanging low along the horizon in the southwest might take a notion to climb up in the heavens at any time and bring about a summer thunderstorm. Apparently Frank did not bother his head in connection with such a possibility, for a little later he wheeled his bicycle out of the shed as though intending to leave the others temporarily. "Be back in half an hour or so, Andy," he called over his shoulder as his cousin came to the door to see what he was about to do. "Going over home for something, Frank?" called Andy, but if the other heard, he chose or some reason to decline to commit himself. Had Andy been able to follow his course after he left the field, he would soon have known that Frank was rather heading for town than intending to pedal in the direction of his own house, which was situated on the outskirts of Bloomsbury. And doubtless the curiosity of Andy would have mounted to near the fever pitch, did he but know that when Frank jumped from his wheel he stood directly in front of the low building known as police headquarters. Without any hesitation the boy walked in through the open door. He had often been here before, and knew the head of the force very well, also the officers who constituted the chief's staff. Chief Waller was bending over his flat-top desk and evidently reading some communication or other. He looked up, and on seeing who his caller was, smiled amiably, for Frank Bird was a favorite of his, and possibly the best-liked boy in Bloomsbury. "Why, glad to see you, Frank. Won't you sit down?" he said, offering his hand to the boy. "I didn't just drop in to chat, Chief," marked Frank, after he had accepted the preferred hand and been favored with a hearty grip. "No, I suppose not, because you're a boy of business generally. Well, what can I do for you, Frank?" asked the other pleasantly. "Your phone here is one of the long-distance ones, isn't it, Chief?" "To be sure, since most of the use we have of it is to talk with other places. Do you want to use it, Frank?" replied the officer. "No, but I'd like you to do something for me, and I'll explain afterwards what my reason is," Frank went on. "Sure I will, my boy. I'd do almost anything to oblige you. Now, who do you want me to get at the other end of the wire?" And as he said this, the chief took down the receiver of the desk phone. "The penitentiary isn't more than 30 miles away from here, is it?" asked Frank. "Whew! Whatever would you be wanting to know from there?" the officer remarked. "Please call them up and ask whether the man you captured a year ago up in the Powell Woods is still doing time there." "You mean Jules Garone, do you?" asked Chief Waller. "That's the man." Still looking at Frank as though wondering what he could mean by such a strange request, the others started operations, and after some skirmishing managed to get in touch with someone who might possibly be the warder of the state penitentiary. "Yes, this is Chief Waller of Bloomsbury," Frank heard him say. "How are you, sir? I would like you to give me a little information connected with a man I had the pleasure of railroading over your way a year ago. His name was Jules Garone, and he was convicted of having broken into the jewelry establishment of Leffingwell." "What's that, sir?" And Frank, watching closely, could see the lips of the chief pursing up, as though he might be tempted to whistle while listening to something the party at the other end of the wire was telling him. Then, perhaps a minute or so later, the chief turned around to Frank as he once more hung up the receiver. "Look here, Frank," he said, exhibiting signs of excitement now. "How did you ever come to know or suspect that?" he demanded. "You have told me nothing yet, Chief," Frank remarked calmly, "but I judge from the way you acted that you heard some surprising news from the warden at the penitentiary. What about Jules, sir?" "He no longer lodges with my friend the warden," went on Waller. "In fact, to tell the whole truth, there was a jail delivery week ago which has been kept secret up to now. The warden says he was just sending out the news when I called him. Jules and 2 other convicts managed to break away, and while the others have been recaptured, Jules is still at large." End of chapter 9.